Okay, so as Daniel said, the title of this next panel is Slasher and the Revaluation of Generic Assumptions. And I have the great honor of introducing our first presenter, Basil Glynn, is Senior Lecturer in Film and Television at Middlesex University, London, and is course leader for the BA Television and Digital Production degree. He is the author of The Mummy on Screen, Orientalism and Monstrosity in Horror Cinema, and co-editor of Television, Sex, and Society, Analyzing Contemporary Representations. His various publications include studies of transnational television drama, crime drama, and British historical drama. The presentation is titled Mute, Masked, and Murderous, the 1940s Mummy as Proto-Slasher.
Thank you very much, Jacqueline, for that introduction. Hello, everybody. While I share my screen, hopefully everybody can see that. So I'm kind of going into the primordial soup, I guess, of slasher movies and trying to determine some forms of origins to them. In the BFI Companion to Horror, Kim Newman defines stalk and slash films as being, and I quote, conceived by Hitchcock's Psycho in 1960, nurtured by Tobe Hooper's The Texas Chainsaw Massacre in 1974, and came of age with John Carpenter's Halloween in 1978. Psycho, as Kim Newman states, is certainly an obvious contender for being the slasher urtext, but other earlier potential candidates have been suggested. Peter Mara, in his 2014 article Strange Pleasure, 1940s Proto-Slasher Cinema, acknowledges that Psycho is frequently identified as the precursor to the slasher film, introducing, as he says, the horror tropes essential for its formulation. Yet he also convincingly argues that Hitchcock's slasher film had notable and often overlooked American-made precursors in films from the classical Hollywood era, and these films include 1943's The Leopard Man, in which someone is killing off the citizens of a small New Mexican town. 1944's The Lodger, a remake of Hitchcock's silent film about Jack the Ripper as a lodger in a London home in the 19th century. 1944's Bluebeard, about an artist in Paris who strangles his portrait models after painting them. 1945's The Spiral Staircase, in which a serial killer is murdering women with disabilities in a town in Vermont. 1945's Hangover Square, depicting the story of a serial strangler of women. And another critic, William Scholl, suggests a couple of other contenders. 1945's Bewitched and 1946's The Dark Mirror. The first about a woman with split personalities, one of whom is evil, and the second about two women who are twins, one of whom is murderously evil. Interestingly, the slasher precursors that both Mara and Scholl suggest are all melodramatic thrillers and not films from the horror genre itself. And this was well established by the 1940s, and this is because of the influence of Psycho as the precursor. In this paper, I'll be arguing that if one looks past Psycho to the slasher horror of the late 70s and early 80s, then one can see that all of the proto-slasher films identified were themselves prefigured by films from the horror genre itself, and specifically the mummy cycle of the early 1940s, as these also introduced many of the horror tropes essential for the slasher film's formulation. So the films I'll be discussing are The Mummy's Hand from 1940, The Mummy's Tomb from 1942, The Mummy's Ghost from 1944, and The Mummy's Curse from 1944. And I'll be especially focusing on the second film in the cycle, The Mummy's Tomb. I won't be arguing that these films were direct influences on the slasher genre. All films and genres have multiple influences. As Barbara Klinger suggests, the context which monitors any film's entry into the world is titanic. Among its representational members are industrial practices of exhibition and distribution, including promotional advertising and popular or academic criticism. Nevertheless, I will be asserting that potentially they might have been direct influences, and that they certainly established particular tropes within the horror genre that were utilised by the slasher film. The second film in the 1940s mummy cycle, 1942's The Mummy's Tomb, is for me the key film as it brought the mummy to America, where he ended up stalking his victims in New England, and more specifically in the town of Mapleton. As Reynold Humphrey says in his book The American Horror Film, echoing Veronica, the notoriety of certain slasher films stemming from their high body count and the amount of gore should not lead us to forget that the central characteristic of the slasher film is the act of stalking victims, and that death by strangulation can also take place. One such murder occurs in Halloween. Mapleton, the American small town haunted by a stalking monster, offers a forerunner to the other natural small towns in American slasher movies, like Haddonfield in Halloween and Springwood in the Nightmare on Elm Street films. In the mummy cycle of the 1940s, the mummy was not just an Egyptian monster, but was established as a small town American one, specifically the Mapleton monster. It wasn't until the 1950s, as Isabel Pinedo points out, that horror films located their scientific monsters in American small towns. Yet here we are actually a decade earlier, seeing the monster moved from the old world horror of Transylvania or fictitious European lands and villages such as Visaria and Regelsburg into a tranquil contemporary American town. The kind of town that would later come under threat in the 1950s from the likes of the Body Snatchers and The Fly, followed in the preceding years by more human killers such as Michael Myers and Jason Voorhees. This innovation hasn't been duly recognised, at least not in a positive sense. William K. Everson argues that bringing the monster to small-town America was a clumsy and unworkable contrivance. The critic Michael Brunus went further still. The idea of a mummy slinking through the back alleys of New England was so ludicrously inappropriate, it engendered little fright or intrigue. Removed from the mystical trappings of Egypt, the mummy seemed more of an anachronism than a monster, more of a curiosity than a threat. However, Douglas Drake, a rather lonely voice amongst critics, disagrees. He said, and I quote, "The mere conception of an Egyptian mummy, supposedly dead for some thousands of years, prowling through the pure Americana of a peaceful New England countryside is horrifying in itself, and this aspect was heavily stressed. The clean white homes of the Connecticut village, the farms, the sheriff's posse hunting down the monster, the fresh, youthful college students, the very air of clean wholesomeness clouded over by the foul breath from an ancient grave, with a horrible Egyptian mummy blundering in the midst of it, all made an incongruous and frightening picture." This notion, this very air of clean, small-town wholesomeness, clouded over by the threat from a monster, to me is also a key aspect of the slasher film. Drake also makes a useful point about incongruity, because incongruity is integral to a great deal of horror, and for some is the essential component of the genre. James Twitchell argues that what we are frightened of usually has to do with the invasion of the abnormal into the world of the normal. Robin Wood offers a simple and obvious basic formula for the horror film. Normality is threatened by the monster. While S.S. Prora argues that horror films often play on the fear that strangers may invade our secure world and destroy us. So like the slasher film, The Mummy of the 1940s brought an unstoppable, semi-supernatural monster into a tranquil suburban world. The mummy itself in The Mummy's Tomb, the second film, the key one for me, is particularly fearsome. Set on fire at the end of the previous film, The Mummy's Hand, and this is, sequelization is also important in the Mummy cycle. In The Mummy's Tomb, he returns as a burnt brute, losing an eye on his charred face and losing a hand too, leaving only a scorched stump. It's a film that sets out to frighten, with not one moment of comedy to lighten the mood, which some of the other Mummy movies had. So to set the scene for the film, Babe Jensen, a character and one of the heroes of the previous film, The Mummy's Hand, reappears in this film. He resurfaces. And just like Loomis does in Halloween, he arrives to warn the townsfolk about the threat of the murderous monster in their midst. But nobody will listen to him or believe him. Then the film goes on to lay out a lot of the ground rules for the late 70s slasher movie by presenting its monstrous killer with a known backstory, going on a murder spree in a small American suburban town, and who remains unseen by any surviving citizens until after the body count has considerably risen. This hunting, monstrous executioner, just as in Halloween and the Friday the 13th series, has his face hidden by a featureless mask. He's also mute. And he proves an astonishingly brutal, virtually unstoppable, hands-on killing machine. He has no sense of fair play and betrays no hint of mercy. He focuses on specific victims, but doesn't care whether he murders innocent bystanders along the way. The brutal and graphic murder was unusual in 1940s horror, largely because of the constraints imposed by the production code after 1934. As John Townsend has argued, post-production code horror saw psychological horror slowly come to the fore in order to avoid censorship issues at home. As Rona Berenstein has further pointed out, as well as American censors, there was also increasing resistance of foreign censors to accept horror films after 1934, further promoting a reduction in explicit scenes. The Mummy's Tomb, however, bucked this trend and proved to be as graphic as any early 1930s horror. In 1942's The Mummy's Tomb, Steve Banning, the character of Steve Banning, who was a hero from the previous film, 1940's The Mummy's Tomb, along with his sister, who are both now aged, this film set 20 years after the first one, they're strangled. Killing off the survivors of the previous film doesn't happen again in the cinema, as far as I'm aware, until Friday the 13th Part 2 in 1981, which opens with the murder of the sole survivor of the previous film, similarly played by the same actor. So The Mummy's Tomb did this 40 years earlier. The Loomis-like Babe Hansen is next, killed in the most explicit murder in the entire Mummy film series. Now, while low-speed pursuit by a semi-crippled mummy may now have become a comic cliche, in this film it's genuinely chilling. The climax of an extended sequence in which the mummy tracks down Hansen is the protracted murder in a back alley of a trapped and terrified man. He runs, he tries to jump a fence in desperation and is dragged down. Cornered, he frantically beats his assailant with a block of wood, the only weapon he can find. But nothing is enough against the relentless and supernaturally strong mummy. He's eventually pushed to the floor, where his legs are kicking and his arms are thumping, and he's overwhelmed and very slowly strangled. It's a scene that perfectly encapsulates the mummy as an emotionless physical killer, devoid of expression or compassion, an emotionally detached automaton. It's this mute, compulsive, single-mindedness of purpose that has served to make him an iconic monster, and which has been adopted by other, more modern monsters too, most effectively, I think, in the slasher film of the late 70s and 80s. Jason Voorhees from the Friday the 13th series and Michael Myers from the Halloween series, like the bandaged mummy first popularized in The Mummy's Hand and The Mummy's Tomb, have black, empty eyes and masked faces. There's no way in. They have little personality, charisma, or pathos, and like the mummy, they are relentless and deaf to all pleas of mercy. It's their inaccessibility that makes them so frightening, because as Bruce Kaywin astutely suggests, What one can talk with, one can generally deal with. Just like the mummy of the Mummy's Tomb and the Mummy's Ghost, Jason and Michael carry out their brutal murders in small-town America and are also charisma and pathos-free monsters who cannot be reasoned with or talked to. So to finish off and to go full circle back to Psycho as the progenitor of the slasher movie, even this has its mummy connection. The author of Psycho, Robert Bloch, had a well-known interest in Jack the Ripper, another originator of the slasher genre, perhaps the earliest, writing stories such as Yours Truly, Jack the Ripper in 1943 and Night of the Ripper in 1984. His interest in Ed Gein is also recognised as an inspiration for Psycho, because he lived just 40 miles from where Gein's murders took place in Wisconsin. Gein is also cited as an inspiration for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Yet as well as the Ripper and Gein, Robert Bloch was also infatuated with the mummy, writing several mummy stories, including The Secrets of Sebek in 1937 and The Eyes of the Mummy in 1938, long before the mummified corpse of Norman Bates' mother makes her climactic shock appearance in Psycho in 1960. After Psycho, Bloch also went on to present yet another mummy on screen in the made-for-TV movie The Cat Creature in 1973. So there are, of course, differences between mummy films, the ones I've discussed, and the slasher film, where the depiction of death is so important, with its victims killed in elaborate and visually interesting ways, and as Jacqueline said in the last panel, the centrality of the final girl. Yet nevertheless, I think The Mummy is well in the mix when one considers proto-slasher films, filtering into the genre through Robert Bloch and Hitchcock's Psycho, through The Mummy's largely unsung influence on the horror genre, through the 1940s mummy film's resurrection in shock theatre on American TV and monster magazines like Famous Monsters of Filmland to influence a new generation of horror filmmakers. And most of all, for establishing small-town America as the home for stalking, utterly silent, supernaturally unstoppable, masked monsters on a murderous mission. And thanks very much for listening. I'll stop sharing.
Excellent. Thank you, Basil, for sharing that. So I have the great honor of introducing our next presenter. John Kavanagh is a PhD student at Ulster University. His research focuses on the slasher film, myths and misconceptions of the subgenre, and the masculinities depicted within these texts. John teaches on the horror film, theory and practice, and issues of performance modules in the cinematic arts and drama departments. His other research interests include late 20th century global cinema, exploitation and abject film, and the recontextualization of visceral/abject horror. John will soon be published in a text on Blumhouse featuring his chapter on Black Christmas, 1974 and 2019, and is a co-editor on Refractory's special edition on non-filmic horror. The presentation is titled, "There Are Certain Rules That One Must Abide By," an examination of the problematic relationship between conservative morality and the slasher film.
Okay, thank you. I'm just going to turn off my camera because I'm showing video clips. Okay. So discussions of victimhood in the slasher film typically revolve around sexual activity and social transgression. Clover frames the killer's motivations as one of sexual repression and the use of violence as an alternative to sexual release. This, combined with the concept that the bladed weapon is a phallic stand-in, leads to the conclusion that murder is a sexual act and that the only character capable of successfully fighting off the slasher villain is the equally repressed and virginal final girl. Aggression is gendered as masculine and victimhood as feminine in this analysis. This leads to masculine victims being coded as feminine and feminine survivors being coded as masculine, which is a non-textual observation. Creed expands upon this concept by calling the slasher villain a blood beast who aims to reveal the feminine interiority, turning every wound into a stand-in for female genitalia. This thought process leads to each act of violence being read as acts of rape, which is also not supported by the texts. The killers are not depicted as being sexually repressed. This is a non-textual analysis that stems from a reductionist psychoanalytical reading supported by earlier scholars such as Derry and Wood. Freudian symbolism and Oedipal conflicts are applied to the surface level of these texts to reach this conclusion. Theorists such as Dika tend to downplay sexual repression in favor of the idea that the slasher villain is a homicidal moralist that hunts for social transgressors and devalued women. Both readings, which have been influential over subsequent analysis, frames the killer as a hedonistic monster or an enforcer of conservative morality. This removes the slasher villain from its socio-political context and promotes a shallow understanding of the slasher subgenre. Many films, particularly in the self-referential cycle of the slasher subgenre, attempted to establish rules that were clearly influenced by the academic theories of the 90s. Randy's concept of the sin factor, discussed in Scream, is the most well-known set of rules and are often repeated as fact by fans. These rules are problematic and are not representative of the slasher subgenre's depiction of victimhood. Let's look at Randy's rules.
How can you watch this shit over and over? Shh. Let me see your breasts. I want to see Jamie Lee's breasts. When do we see Jamie Lee's breasts, Brett?
Not until Trading Places in '83. Jamie Lee was always a virgin in horror movies. She never showed her tits until she went legits.
Could afford a decent pair.
What'd you say? That's why she always outsmarted the killer in the big chase scene at the end. Only virgins can do that. Don't you know the rules? What rules? You don't... Jesus Christ, you don't know the rules?
Have an aneurysm, why don't you?
There are certain rules that one must abide by in order to successfully survive a horror movie. For instance, number 1, you can never have sex. Big no-no! Big no-no! Sex equals death, okay? Number 2, you can never drink or do drugs. The sin factor. It's a sin. It's an extension of number 1. And number 3, never, ever, ever, under any circumstances say, I'll be right back. Because you won't be back.
I'm getting another beer. You want one?
Yeah, sure.
I'll be right back.
You see, you push the laws and you end up dead. Okay, I'll see you in the kitchen with a knife.
The concepts of sin and social transgression is better utilized in the psychosexual thriller, a subgenre often combined with the slasher subgenre in academic analysis that consists of films such as Dressed to Kill, Cruising, and Silence of the Lambs. Slasher villains don't target specific individuals in accordance with the sin factor. Their victims are in their immediate environment. Jason Voorhees' rampages begin with characters that invade the rural wilderness, which has been tamed for recreational use, such as summer camps, holiday homes, and rehabilitation. Jason represents the type of horror once thought to be tamed due to both Western expansion and capitalistic pursuits. Even the films where he is removed from the Crystal Lake environment, such as Jason Takes Manhattan and Jason X, begin with an incursion on the cursed land. Jason is the antithesis of Reaganite excess and luxury. Freddy Krueger's murder spree almost exclusively takes place in Springwood, beginning on Elm Street and expanding as his pool of victims dwindle. The Elm Street children aren't targeted for their own actions, regardless of whether they commit social transgressions or not. They are targeted for their parents' misdeeds. Once Freddy's remit goes beyond the specific street, he targets teens that he has access to via the surviving Springwood characters, such as Alice and John Doe. Freddy is the personification of the moral panics and culture wars between the conservative suburbanites that strive to protect the ideals of family values and the youth culture that strives for social progression. Michael Myers may specifically target members of the Myers, Strode, and Lloyd lineage, but the ancillary victims are not attacked due to their own actions. It is their proximity to characters such as Laurie and Jamie that codes them as victims. Michael is the horror hidden behind the white picket fence to maintain the illusion of suburban security and virtuosity. He is the counterpoint to the suburban fiction that would lead to the downfall of the Carter era and the beginning of the reactionary and socially conservative Reagan era, further proving that the slasher villain is driven by territorial obsessions and opportunistic murder rather than sexual repressions or Freudian urges. Each murder acts as a way of containing the situation within the chosen environment, as the slasher villain turns their victims' environmental security into vulnerability, takes advantage of the confidence that breeds a lack of situational awareness, and stalks them in their isolation. The reductionist analysis relating to the killer and the survivor's sexual repression and the victim's explicit sexuality conceals the nuances of the slasher subgenre and frames the slasher film as a repetitive sequence of events. The virginal final girl is a staple of slasher theory, but it isn't overly representative of the actual survivors of the texts. The early entries of the Friday the 13th series feature survivors that are heavily implied to be in sexual relationships, or at the very least sexually active, such as Alice, Ginny, and Chris. These survivors do not behave in a sexually repressed manner. Instead, their actions are almost indistinguishable from the soon-to-be victims. More important than the concept of virginity is that of trauma. Survivors of the Friday the 13th franchise must be capable of coping with their trauma to survive. Survivors that do appear to be virgins do not seem to abstain from sexual acts for psychoanalytical reasons, such as Laurie in Halloween and Nancy in A Nightmare on Elm Street. Laurie is the only girl in the group targeted by Michael that isn't in a relationship. Despite this, she still expresses interest in Ben Tramer. She admits that her inability to find a boyfriend is due to boys being intimidated by her. Laurie's shyness keeps her sexually inactive, not an adherence to conservative social expectations. Nancy, on the other hand, is in a relationship, but it appears to be reserved. Nancy declines Glenn's sexual advances, but only to look out for her friends and to focus on defeating Freddy. None of these characters are the almost asexual heroines ready to turn their frustration into the strength needed to fight back against the deviant monster. Regardless of whether these survivors are virginal or sexually active, there are many characters within these texts that are depicted as sexually inactive, but won't be saved by their either willing or unwilling celibacy. An archetype has emerged within these texts, the lonely loser and the prankster, who attempts to seduce women in a childlike manner and inevitably becomes angry at them or sulks when they are refused. Prankster characters in later cycles get closer to sexual gratification, but will be denied completion. These men may not be sexually repressed, but they are much more sexually frustrated than the survivors, and it clearly isn't weaponized against the killer. If male virgins can't overcome the slasher villain, then maybe female virgins, or at least women who don't have sexual encounters within the narrative, can survive an encounter with the killer. Academic theory would suggest this to be true, but there are many women that abstain from sexual activity and reject potential male partners within these films, yet are still victimized. Some of these women actively reject sexual propositions, and the others are never approached by men at all. If anything, they are coded more strongly as virgins than the women who actually survive the narrative. Alongside the academic and social fixation on virginity, there is an overwhelming obsession with sex and sexuality depicted within the texts. Reading about the slasher subgenre and listening to the socially accepted fan view, it would be easy to mistake the slasher film for a pseudo-snuff film preceded by a teen orgy. The reality is that not every teen is participating in sexual acts on screen. Normally, there is only one explicit sexual encounter depicted on screen in each film, either as the act itself or through implication with a post-coital sequence. In the classical cycle, these characters will die, sometimes together and sometimes alone. The connection between sex and death appears to be a suitable reading of the sequence, but correlation does not prove causation. If the killer was truly targeting sexually active teens, then the previously shown characters would survive the narrative. There must be another answer, and that lays within the concepts of security and paranoia. Tudor presents the concepts of security and paranoia as the key to differentiating between classic and modern horror. Security and concepts such as science, religious faith, and personal strength are the keys to defeating the monster and returning the narrative to normality in the classical horror text. The modern horror film subverts these concepts and ensures the death of anyone foolish enough to be secure in the previously listed virtues as well as their immediate environment. The slasher villain uses the security and turns it into vulnerability as they take advantage of the teens and their lack of awareness. Having sex in an unknown environment, whether if it's a cabin, a neighbor's suburban home, or the woods, is the ultimate exercise of security. And it is this security transformed into unknowing vulnerability that codes the teens participating in sexual acts as victims. The killer does not care about the differences between promiscuity or conservative concepts such as social transgressions or personal devaluation. The killer wants to hunt the vulnerable, and copulating teens guarantee them multiple victims in one environment. The concept of security turned into vulnerability is best shown by the murders of Jeff and Sandra in Friday the 13th Part 2. As the pair have sex, Jason lifts a spear, ascends the stairs, and walks towards the couple in bed. Sandra only realizes that they are in danger when the masked figure impales them both. and Jeff can never understand their situation, as his only warning was a gasp that could be mistaken for a moan. Sandra and Jeff, like other sexually active couples in the slasher film, have fallen victim to their own isolation and lack of awareness, fostered by their focus on each other. Their security in their environment and in each other allows Jason to take advantage and gain 2 easy victims for his kill count. It would be naive to say there isn't an element of titillation involved in these scenes depicting sexual acts, but the theorists read this in a manner that either completely separates the nudity and violence, stating that it is either to excite the presumed male audience with the feminine form and satisfy the bloodlust of the audience with a horrific set piece, or that it reinforces the psychosexual themes of the subgenre by presenting the sequence as an alternative to rape. Instead, the titillating elements reinforce the horror of the sequence. For example, Linda's death sequence in Halloween focuses on her mistaking Michael for her boyfriend Bob. She reveals herself to the stalking shape and stands up to make a phone call to Laurie. Her nudity isn't entirely to excite the audience. It perfectly emphasizes both her security and vulnerability in this environment. She stands naked in front of a figure that she should not trust and is unaware of its intent, leading to her strangulation. This is not a punitive murder, an act of devaluation, or a cautionary tale warning against teenage sexuality. This sequence presents the dangers of the white middle-class lies of suburban security. Most instances of nudity in the classical cycle fulfill this function of exposing the dichotomy of security and vulnerability. Drugs and alcohol are another pair of vices the theorists and fans assume leads to victimhood in the slasher subgenre. Much like sexual activity, drug use will not lead to death, as there are many contradictory depictions for both victims and survivors. Most that watch the slasher film from this conservative perspective tend to forget that one of the most iconic survivors, Laurie Strode, smokes a joint with Annie on their way to their babysitting job in Halloween. Both characters know that this is a social transgression as they panic when they encounter Sheriff Brackett investigating a break-in at the hardware store. This takes place as Michael is following them in another car. He sees this act, yet Laurie survives their encounter. Both their drug use and the way they hide it suggest that smoking a joint is more of a youth culture versus family values issue rather than a true social transgression. Just like experimental sexual activity, recreational drug use is another aspect of teen life, and anyone claiming it to be an action worthy of a gruesome death would be firmly placed in the conservative viewership. Later in the series, Laurie develops a dependency on alcohol to combat her trauma and suppress her hallucinations and anxiety in Halloween H2O and Halloween 2018. Laurie survives both encounters as her role as a survivor is maintained by her ongoing paranoia and her eventual ability to interact with her traumas, both past and present. Many other survivors of the classical cycle also consume drugs or alcohol, either explicitly or implicitly in the films. Ginny and Paul of the Friday the 13th franchise drink and smoke. Paul even states that the counselors in training smoke better grass than he does, forming a recreational link between the senior and junior counselors, the living and the dead. Ted would be considered the smartest man of the Friday the 13th franchise as he disobeys Paul's order to return to camp when the bar closes. Instead, he finds an after-hours club and takes the other counselors in training, sparing them all from Jason's rampage. Ginny, Paul, and Ted have the same vices, but one of them escapes the horror and the inflicted trauma by indulging himself. Partying is more likely to save lives, but only, and I mean only, if it results in the characters removing themselves from the dangerous environment. The survivors and victims of the A Nightmare on Elm Street franchise have an interesting relationship with vices, as they do not have many opportunities to consume alcohol or illegal drugs. They are typically stuck in the suburban home under the watch of their controlling, neglectful, or abusive parents, which limits their opportunities to be regular teens. Despite this, the teens tend to develop dependencies on legal drugs, such as caffeine to stay awake, or dangerous prescription pills, such as Hypnosil, to suppress their dreams. Legal drugs are a tool for survival in this franchise, but it only buys those teens a bit of time, as not many characters have survived the overall narrative due to Freddy's complete control of the franchise's environment. If survivors can freely consume drugs, both legal and illegal, then what about the victims who seem to die due to their drug use? Usually, deaths that are mistaken for drug-related murders refer more to the concept of confidence than that of morality and social transgression. Security and confidence should be differentiated, as Tudor's concept of security, when applied to the slasher subgenre, should reflect the environments of the film and the attitudes of the characters, whereas confidence reflects the characters' actions. This idea of drug-induced confidence is depicted often in the classical cycle, not just the self-referential cycle. This confidence, much like security, undermines any sense of awareness that the characters would have. The social transgression is not punished, despite what theorists and the socially accepted analysis of the slasher subgenre would insist on. Again, it is the victim's lack of environmental awareness that dooms them. Chuck and Chili of Friday the 13th Part 3 spent the entire film inebriated, which leads to them not noticing the many warning signs within the narrative. None of their fellow victims were aware of their environment or situation either, but Chuck and Chili are the last to die, before Chris and Rick return to the house in the finale. Many warning signs presented themselves, but the pair did not have the ability to recognize their danger. They only react when it's too late. The stoner character is typically slow and is included to elevate the kill count prior to the climax of the narrative due to their complete lack of awareness. Sex, alcohol, and drugs cover a few of the social transgressions that a conservative reading of the slasher film focuses on, but this analysis also includes a focus on a conservative virtue long used in American culture, the underdog hero. Typically, the final girl is the hero discussed, but she only survives this discourse due to her alleged masculine attributes. Unfortunately, masculine heroism is actively punished in the slasher film, as any character that displays any heroic virtues will be coded as victims and not survive for long. Classical heroes attempt to use their knowledge, strength, and faith to defeat the monster, and will ultimately fail in the modern horror film. One character that displays each of these attributes and provides a great summation of heroic efforts in the slasher subgenre is Julius in Jason Takes Manhattan. Julius, realizing that he is cornered by Jason, decides to fight back. He has faith in his own strength and knowledge of boxing technique. By classical horror rules, he could have survived, but in the modern era, he'll die in a self-referential manner. The heroism that Julius displays is masculine and doomed to fail, as it focuses on the concepts of security and confidence, death sentences in the slasher film. It may be the longest anyone has fought hand-to-hand against Jason, but this masculine display is undermined when he's decapitated with one punch. It would be hard to argue that Julius was feminized by Jason's attack, or that the interiority revealed recalls feminine symbolism as suggested by Clover and Creed's analysis of the male victim. Instead, it has similar implications as Linda's death in Halloween, or Jeff and Sandra's in Friday the 13th Part 2. It isn't a social transgression or any sinful behavior that leads to Julius's death. It is the concepts of security and confidence being transformed into vulnerability and a lack of awareness. Julius appears to have the upper hand until he wears himself out and reveals his folly, as we're just about to see. The final girl trope and other similar readings of the survivor of the slasher film follows the idea that a virginal woman will emerge from the ordeal as the victor, a modern hero that will not yield to human vices and will fight back against the villain, unlike the victims around her. This reading is misleading, as quite often the survivor will not have put up much of a fight against the killer. Survival in the classical cycle comes from stamina and resourcefulness rather than strength or a cathartic release. Paranoia and insecurity are traits shown by each survivor, and they will aid these characters much more than adhering to social expectations and conservative moralities ever will. The fact that psychoanalytical analysis that exists to blame victims for their own murders is being used, particularly in the current socially aware cycle of the slasher subgenre, is problematic and continues to reduce these texts into cautionary tales that don't work, as the sin factor never actually guided these survivors in the classical cycle. This paper has examined only a few of the conservative moralisms that are the foundation of slasher theory, and has discovered that the concepts of social transgressions and traditional heroism do not apply to the slasher film. Randy's rules do not apply, as the sin factor is inherently flawed. Conservative values belong in the classical era of horror, in the time before American conservatism redefined the concept of family values to be used as political ammunition. The application of these concepts to the slasher film do not work, as it is almost a non-causal narrative as far as victimhood is concerned. The only true markers of survival in the classical cycle is a sense of paranoia and insecurity in their environment, which aids their sense of awareness, the ability to interact with their past, and ongoing trauma which allows them to react to the situation, and the inability to display classical heroic traits. The self-referential cycle rewrote the rules due to the emergence of slasher theory that advocated a psychoanalytical reading of the semiotics of the subgenre, and the emergence of films like Scream that focused more on how we perceived slasher films rather than building upon what slasher films are. There are films that predate the theorists of the 90s and the self-referential cycle that actively dismiss the conservative reading of the slasher film, such as The Dream Warriors, where a constant battle rages between family values, represented by Dr. Sims, and a youth culture represented by Kincaid and the other teens. Sims insists that their dreams that are killing the children are psychological scars stemming from moral conflicts and overt sexuality. Kincaid replies to this with, "Oh great, it's my dick that's killing me." Sims is depicted as completely out of touch, and the teens that mock her save themselves. Scarily, similar academic theory managed to become dominant even when Sims' psychoanalytical analysis of the slasher film is ridiculed by the very teens that it aims to blame for their own deaths. Luckily, the conservative moralisms that plague the slasher subgenre have finally been exorcised, and the current cycle of the slasher subgenre, allowing new work to overcome the theoretical constraints of the past. I'd like to end on a question. Does this woman, depicted on screen, deserve the death that will come in a few moments solely due to the fact that she is confident in her own sexuality? Or do we need to rethink the nature of victimhood in the slasher subgenre and address our current readings of the killer? Thank you for listening, folks.
Thank you so much for that, John. That was an outstanding presentation. I have the great honor of introducing our next presenter. Marc Olivier is Professor of French Studies at Brigham Young University. He is author of Household Horror, Cinematic Fear, and the Secret Life of Everyday Objects, and series editor for the forthcoming Icons of Horror series with Indiana University Press. The presentation is titled Tools of the Trade, a statistical analysis of slasher hardware.
Okay, let me just share screen. Okay. All right, I'm going to assume that everyone can see that and just jump in if something goes wrong. Only one person dies by chainsaw in the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. A more accurate title might be the Texas Cattle Hammer Massacre, given that Leatherface wields the specialized sledgehammer in 2 of his 4 kills. In a sample of 5 Texas Chainsaw films and 40 deaths, only 5 characters are killed by chainsaw. The device looms large over the genre despite its rare use in slasher kills. In fact, shards of glass are weaponized in slashers as frequently as chainsaws, while swords account for nearly 3 times as many deaths. Many influential studies of the genre fall prey to what I call the chainsaw effect, the phenomenon usually driven by the affective impact of select objects or scenes, which leads to broad assertions about slashers that ring true but do not stand up to empirical scrutiny. Only a handful of statistical studies of slashers exist, and they're almost exclusively devoted to testing Carol Clover's claims about the final girl. Meanwhile, the 5 other subheadings that Clover presents as main ingredients of a slasher, killer, terrible place, weapons, victims, and shock, receive far less attention. Weapons, above all, present a curious gap in scholarship considering the genre is named after blade-assisted violence. As I've argued in Household Horror, object-centered readings of cinematic horror reveal the complex and ongoing negotiations behind our coexistence with the non-human. With that in mind, I've conducted what I think is the first empirical study of slasher weapons based on a corpus of 119 US or Canadian produced or co-produced slashers from 1974 to 2019. I've created a corpus that represents a mix of popular franchises, low-budget cult classics. I've included 14 films from the 1970s, followed by 42 from the 80s, 20 from the 90s, 23 from the 2000s, and 20 from the 2010s. In total, I've recorded 1,177 deaths, from which I've excluded suicides and accidental deaths for a total of 1,130. I tracked tool used by aggressor, the villain, and the attacked, the victim, for each kill, and for fighting sequences leading to each kill. Among other details, I recorded kill locations and the gender, age range, social class, race, ethnicity, and sexual orientation of the aggressor and the attacked. In adopting a data-driven approach, I aim to eliminate the chainsaw effect and do for weapons and items repurposed as such what other studies have done for the final girl, namely to demystify the received slasher rules and to question ideas that have been overdetermined by confirmation bias. Slashing is a murderous craft typically performed by white, heterosexual, huge caveat there about that, man in clothing associated with the working class and using tools connected to working class trades. Nearly half of the slasher villains are working class, while half of slasher victims are middle class. The class warfare that undergirds the genre is reinforced by weaponized tools meant for chopping wood, carpentry, agriculture, mining, and other blue-collar work. Villains from poor and working classes kill with agricultural tools more often than killers from the middle class and upper class. Similarly, the use of carpentry tools decreases as class levels elevate. In contrast, the upper class uses knives more than any other group and is likely to repurpose tools and is less likely to repurpose tools as weapons than other classes, preferring instead to kill with implements designed to be weapons. The number of working class killers would increase if code switching through clothing and or tools were factored into the equation. Michael Myers, for example, is a child from a middle class home when he commits his first murder. Once grown into a homicidal mental hospital escapee known as the Shape and later the Boogeyman, he prefers the look of a mechanic, so much so that he wears coveralls as his signature outfit for the entire franchise. Thanks to the coveralls, the Shape is not just any silhouette, but specifically one coded as working class. His signature weapon, however, is not a wrench or a screwdriver, but a chef's knife, a kitchen tool used more often by the middle class. A signature weapon defines a killer. Who is Freddy Krueger without the glove of finger knives crafted in his boiler room? Less handy killers must resort to ready-made tools. The titular murderer in The Driller Killer is a New York City artist struggling to finish his next major painting. Late one night, a television commercial for the Portapak portable battery catches his eye. He buys one the following day, and now, corded drill in hand, the Portapak at his side, the Driller Killer is born. Miller's battery-operated homicidal hobby reinvigorates his work. His mechanical killings fuse with his art as he smears blood into what he believes to be his masterpiece. He presents the painting to his agent, who calls the work a piece of shit and yells, "The worst thing that can happen to a painter is happening to you. You're becoming simply a technician." Like a sick punchline, the worst part of becoming the Driller Killer, it turns out, is not the descent into madness, but the ensuing Icarian fall from high art to working class technician. As Miller becomes a murder by numbers Driller Killer, he also becomes a paint by numbers artist. Slashers fetishize tools for their latent power to serve as weapons. In the tradition of the giallo, the slasher points the viewer's eyes to the instruments of death, while the human wielding the weapon hovers in darkness or occupies a portion of the screen. The killer is a broken human, a fractured partial being that draws out the violent side of a fireplace poker, nail gun, ice pick, axe, hammer, pitchfork, and other objects that were never designed to be weapons. In the Toolbox Murders, like the Driller Killer, or rather the titles, Toolbox Murders, Driller Killer, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, foreground tools rather than the person wielding them. The Toolbox Killer, Kingsley, is another code-switching killer, a rich man in a worker's coat, dark pants, and a ski mask. Like Michael Myers, he is a blue-collar Shape, dressed in black and emptied of humanity. He murders as if puppeteering a show about the hidden life of sinister tools. Like Wall Street ladder climber Patrick Bateman in American Psycho, he is simply not there, or rather, he is defined almost entirely by his objects. In addition to class bias, slasher weapons reveal a gender imbalance that makes the use of weapons somewhat less empowering for women than is commonly believed. Overall, women use cooking tools nearly twice as often as men when making a kill. During a fight, women use cooking tools 3 times as often as men. And the gender split is even greater when the numbers exclude the villains. When adding all household categories, cooking, small appliances, furniture, and other household items, women under attack use household items 68% of the time compared to 13% for men. Similarly, male and female victims show an imbalance when it comes to household goods as weapon choice. When under attack, men prefer firearms. Oh, let me see. There we go. Men prefer firearms 45% of the time compared to 12.7% for women. Men also prefer carpentry tools more than women. 6.32 to 11.4. The gender imbalance of household items leads to scenes of mismatched power between male villains and female victims. A woman with a vase fights a man with a nail gun in the Toolbox Murders. A woman with a broom takes on a man with a gun in Hills Have Eyes. A woman uses a figurine against a man with a knife in Slumber Party Massacre. A woman with a telephone and a kitchen knife fights Ghostface and his hunting knife in Scream, and so on. Most victims are taken by surprise, but when the attacked do fight back, men are the most likely to arm themselves with objects designed to be weapons, while women are left to improvise with household objects such as cooking tools and furniture. According to Clover, in the hands of the killer at least, guns have no place in slasher films. Victims sometimes use guns, she says, but they fail in a pinch. The reality is more complicated. The aggressor does in fact use guns for the kill 10.6% of the time, placing firearms 4th among the top categories of weapons used by the killer. When the attacked defeat the killer, firearms are to thank 12.5% of the time. For the fight itself, as opposed to the kill, the attack turns to guns more frequently than any other weapon, 30.4%. Knives earn the top spot for the killer during the fight, but firearms still take 6th place, just below carpentry tools. Clearly, guns play a significant role in slasher films, even if their comparative lack of novelty makes them less memorable than other weapons. Despite frequent gun use in slashers, scenes that promote ambivalence or hostility toward firearms are not uncommon. Although the attacked use guns more frequently during a fight, they're more likely to kill their aggressor with knives, cooking tools, or agricultural tools. Arguably, the gap between using a gun in the fight and succeeding at making a kill with a gun complicates the story. Now, I wish I had time to go into the Halloween franchise relationship with guns, but just consider the fact that in the 2018 installment, despite Laurie's basement arsenal, a cast iron skillet and a kitchen knife are the final weapons used to push Michael into a cage for incineration. And not surprisingly, the trapdoor is in the kitchen. Symbolic repudiation of firearms in slashers offer anecdotal support for the spirit of Clover's claim that guns have no place in the genre, even if the data prove otherwise. The opening sequence of Maniac Cop features a Colt Python, but the gun remains holstered for the duration of the movie. Instead, the Maniac Cop uses a dagger that he keeps sheathed at his side like a police baton. In Destroyer, a killer lowers a jackhammer on a gun just as a police officer is reaching for it. Final Exam foreshadows gun violence early in the film by referencing the Texas Tower sniper, but in the climactic tower scene, we see a knife and a bow and arrow. The adage, "don't bring a knife to a gunfight," is bad advice in a slasher, where blades beat bullets more often than logic would dictate. A few examples of guns losing the battle Sword beats gun in Redeemer, Son of Satan. Blood Rage, machete beats guns. Crucifix beats guns in Prom Night 4. Scythe beats gun in Hills Run Red. Primitive Weapons beat gun in The Hills Have Eyes. Meat Hook beats gun in See No Evil. When ranked by specific weapon used for kills rather than categories, hunting knives and kitchen knives take first and second place, but handguns are just behind in third place, and long guns take fifth place just after drills. Slasher weapons such as machetes, pickaxes, hooks, swords, scythes, and pitchforks appear in far fewer kills than guns. 86% of slasher deaths happen without the attacked fighting back with any object. Sustained weapons-heavy fight scenes are often reserved for the killer and the final character, distinguished by from typical hapless victims, not only by using and creating weapons, but by using more of them than the killer. Nearly 1/3 of the films studied include a final fight scene during which the attacked wield at least one more weapon than the killer. In 27 of those, the attacked employ at least 2 more weapons than the killer. Those high-profile cases, while not a majority, provide the template for the conventional final girl narrative. Final battles vary in their levels of empowerment. Often, a final girl uses a combination of weapons and weaponized objects, but is ultimately saved by a man with a gun. In Scream 2, Sidney uses a hunting knife, a bottle, an axe, and stage decor and lighting, but is saved by Cotton Weary, who defeats Loomis with a gun. In Scream 3, Sidney uses a hunting knife, handgun, ice pick, vase, candlestick, and furniture in her fight with Roman, but in the end, Dewey makes a kill with a gun. In Terror Train, Jamie Lee Curtis plays the final girl who fights the villain with a sword, a receipt spike, and a fire extinguisher, but is saved by a conductor who hits the killer out of the speeding train with a shovel. Bearing in mind that fewer than 1/4 of slashers culminate in all-out displays of clever weaponry, final battles merit attention nonetheless as reminders of the centrality of objects in the genre. When final girl, Chris, fights Jason in Friday the 13th, Part 3, she uses a chair, bookshelf, firewood, knife, shovel, van, a rope and pulley, a machete, and an axe. In Friday the 13th, 1980, Alice fights Pamela with a fireplace poker, an iron skillet, a ball of twine, or a shotgun, and she beheads the victim with a machete. Since houses and apartments are by far the most common locations for slasher violence, followed by domestic interiors and cars, we can also relate to the spaces of slasher kills. One need not be a teen at summer camp to identify with a victim. In fact, most victims are 19 to 25 years old, 33%, or 26 to 35 years old, 23.7%. This means that slasher audiences will often encounter adults in domestic settings where the choice of possible weapons requires imagination. And that object-focused imagination is what survives the film, even when the victims do not. Let me conclude by returning to the chainsaw effect. The fact that there are only 9 kills by chainsaw across 1,117 kills tracked to the study demonstrates the need for more empirical inquiries concerning the role of objects in horror. In other words, if firearms are responsible for 111 slasher kills and chainsaws for only 9, it may be worth investigating why Men, Women, and Firearms would never be as effective a title as Men, Women, and Chainsaws. My study has tracked a lot of data points, but I have not collected data such as object appearances in trailers and posters, screen time of objects that are not part of kill scenes, the audible presence of objects, and other cinematic manifestations that might establish a different hierarchical list, perhaps one in which the chainsaw reigns supreme empirically as a signifier of slasher horror. Slasher studies need empirical research to recalibrate the relation between human and non-human actors. To better account for the work performed by objects, we must move beyond the conventional view of objects as props for humans and instead consider how humans and monsters serve as props for objects. For the purpose of an object-centered analysis, it may be therefore fruitful to say that final girls and boys, like slasher villains, are often stock figures that serve a common cause. They animate the objects that share our living spaces, clutter our closets, hide in our basements and sheds, or go camping with us. They demonstrate how those objects can turn against us or save us. Slashers are as much about the repairman as the boogeyman. A slasher turns a kitchen into an armory, a toolbox into an arsenal. In the end, our fear of Leatherface might fade with the credits, but lurking in sheds everywhere are chainsaws that will never be the same. Thanks. Let me stop share. Okay.
Excellent. Thank you very much for that presentation. So I have the great honor of introducing the final presenter of this panel. Miranda Ruth Larsen is a PhD candidate in the Information, Technology, and Society in Asia program at the University of Tokyo. She specializes in transcultural media and gender studies. She is the author of Don't Adjust Your Life to Mine, Moonchild Homoeroticism and the Vampire as Multifaceted Other in the Global Vampire and Popular Culture, and Desktop Horror and Captive Cinema in Confessions of an ACA-Fans Cult Conversations. Her found footage film tally currently stands at 217. The presentation is titled Gazes, Glitches, and Gore, Found Footage Slashers as Records of Violence.
Thank you for the introduction, Jacqueline. Let me get my screen up. Okay, so please feel free to tweet about this paper using my Twitter handle at akaotaku, which is on this, probably one of my favorite opening slides for a presentation I've done. And please note that this presentation also contains spoilers for numerous films. So do what you must if you are concerned about that. So let's get started. As we've discussed quite a bit this weekend and even on this panel, the beginning of the slasher genre or subgenre or its own field is still debated. While I recognize the importance of entries like Black Christmas and even Peeping Tom, my analysis recognizes Carpenter's Halloween as the major starting point in the popular imaginary. As many of you are aware, this film begins with an extremely memorable opening sequence. A killer stalks about, masked and dangerous. He stabs a young woman. After this violent act, the attacker leaves the house. Our POV view is lost when the mask is removed. And we see that this is a young boy dressed in a clown costume and wielding a knife. The sequence remains unsettling in its combination of POV stalking, murder, and the reveal that the killer is only a young boy. The chilling effects of this scene are referenced and recreated in numerous slasher films, and one of the reasons slashers have earned an uneasy reputation. Linda Williams, for example, decried the viewer as killer setup as inherently misogynistic, and slashers as, quote, offensive films, end quote. Of course, the slasher is, in fact, a fruitful site for analyzing the themes that make horror relevant, particularly anxieties about gender and violence. In this paper, then, I will look at the marriage between two supposedly disreputable horror subgenres, the slasher and the found footage film. Scholar Cecilia Syed notes that, quote, with the found footage horror film, the interpretation of reality and fiction that was traditionally discussed in terms of allegory or topical references has found a new locus, the film's form, end quote. This attention to form is, of course, what causes divisive reactions to found footage. You may know someone or perhaps be one of those people who says, I hate shaky cam, I hate static cams looking for ghosts in the middle of the night. These have to do with found footage's form. Found footage, of course, faces similar discussions and criticisms that slashers encountered in the 1980s and beyond. Nevertheless, in my own article, Desktop Horror and Captive Cinema, I argue that, quote, carefully constructed found footage horror accomplishes sensory states better than many narrative horror films because of the collapsing boundaries between the diegesis and reality, end quote. I would call myself a found footage apologist, except I'm in no way sorry for this filmmaking mode. At present, I've seen 217 found footage films, and in doing so, I've concluded that the found footage slasher is a rare species, one eclipsed by other modes like the paranormal or even the alien abduction film. Only about 20 films of those 217 fit the idea of a slasher, and many of those 20 serve more as snuff films with slasher elements. Some of the examples on this slide, like Capture, Kill, Release, feature aspiring killers working up to the brutal act. Others, like 4K Killer, involve an already active murderer documenting their kills with a GoPro. These films vary in quality and cinematic technique, but all touch upon the power of the camera gaze, the killer's gaze, in relation to violence. I will now overview 4 of these films and expand on how the found footage slasher routinely guides us to consider the implications of recording violence. The Poughkeepsie tapes, rated R by the MPAA for sadistic violence and torture, including terror and graphic descriptions, sit somewhere between mockumentary and snuff film. It is, in actuality, footage to be found, as there was a 10-year delay between theater exhibition and then physical media. I want to begin my analysis here because of the film's commitment to the idea of literal found footage as records of violence. It is billed in the same vein as the Blair Witch Project, as you can see from the quoted taglines. In the 2000s, a serial killer terrorized an upstate New York town. Some murderers leave clues, some leave warnings, and this one left the Poughkeepsie tapes. The film's talking heads, and who are analyzing the tapes and the killer, are continuously in awe of the killer's penchant for filming, which totals thousands of hours of tape. The fraction that we see as the audience often falls in traditional slasher modes: stalking, capture, torture, and death of primarily female victims. This image, for example, could easily be a POV shot from a traditional slasher at the moment when someone realizes that the home invasion is happening. In one pivotal scene, an examiner reflects on the killer's abduction of a couple. The doomed pair has picked up the killer, posing as a hitchhiker, and he settles in the backseat of their car with his camera. He eventually kills the husband, causing the car to crash into a tree. He then incapacitates the wife, filming the entire incident while managing to hide his face behind the car seat. The examiner who is viewing this footage notes, "Imagine what it would take to do this. From the seat behind her, he takes a rag with some sort of chemical agent with his right hand, and he places it over her mouth. And with his left hand holding the camera, he's reaching it out and holding it in front of her face like this. I mean, this isn't the kind of thing that just happens. He must have practiced this motion thoroughly to get it right." This is, of course, as I qualified it, begrudging awe. The killer later removes the husband's head in this sense and surgically grafts it into the wife's torso. He then wakes her up from the anesthesia required for the procedure to gleefully document her reaction to something that disturbing. So in the Poughkeepsie tapes, we have records of a madman's violence that is considered too disturbing to watch in full. The clips from his recordings are often interrupted by talking heads and glitches, many at strategic moments as an editing technique to spare us the worst of his carnage. Nevertheless, what we are allowed to see is still profoundly disturbing. A man obsessed with masks and theatricality, someone who considers camera angles to the same degree as dismemberment methods. The Poughkeepsie tapes warns that finding and viewing footage is dangerous. The same examiner who is in awe of the killer's camera skills admits that his wife wouldn't have sex with him for months after she accidentally viewed one of the tapes. Issues of sexual intimacy and its relationship to gender and violence remain a thread throughout these films, as it's part of their slasher DNA. Another entry, Home Movie, attaches gender anxieties to the diegetic camera as budding slashers are slowly unmasked. Psychologist Claire and Lutheran pastor David, pictured here, record holidays after moving to rural New York State. Their 8-year-old twins, Jack and Emily, born on, of all accursed dates, Halloween, demonstrate an escalating pattern of odd and violent behavior. These twins throw rocks at their parents, place a frog in vice grips, kill their pet goldfish and put them in sandwiches, crucify the family cat, bite each other and a boy at school, and eventually attempt to kill the same boy on Easter. While their father is convinced that the twins are possessed, their mother believes they are exhibiting behavior due to hidden abuse by David. The twins are noticeably mute for most of the film, communicating in shrugs and nods to their parents and a gibberish language with each other. Notably, David considers the twins sharing a bed despite having separate bedrooms as cute, while Claire labels it disturbing, hinting at incestuous anxieties amplified by the twin bond. As the film is comprised of holiday-based home movies and the parents' confessional diaries, everyone in the film handles the camera at some point, all 4 family members. It is a frequent topic of conversation, as shown in these 2 images, with constant struggle between the parents about cost and purpose. So in the first image, David has the camera in Claire's face, and she's saying she doesn't want to talk to him, not because of him, it's not you, it's the fucking camera. In the bottom image, Claire has control of the camera, and David sarcastically quips, "Oh, so you get to film the children, but I don't." So the camera equals control. Of course, a la Mulvey's theories. So Claire bought the camera as the family breadwinner, but David is the one who uses it at each holiday to document his happy family. In the climax of the film, a glitch and rewind reveals everything we have witnessed is footage the twins have been reviewing on a TV screen. Emily now wields the camera and films her brother, shown in this image. Jack welcomes the audience to the Jack and Emily show and then taunts us for being so quiet. He then dares us to watch until their film is completed. The twins then begin to prepare for murder, gathering supplies and sabotaging their house. They film all of this, swapping the camera silently and sharing in its power to document their deeds. After finally binding their parents to the dining room table and placing them in garbage bags, as shown in my title slide, more glitches obfuscate whether they actually kill their parents. Either way, the adult bodies are limp by the time we see the final shot of the film, Emily covering the camera while simultaneously peering into it. Home movie then returns us to unease about nature versus nurture, mental illness versus spiritual afflictions, and systematically documents 2 young children becoming untethered from societal norms on their path to slasherhood. Conversely, Hangman operates as a sustained home invasion film. It follows another family of 4 as they are slowly terrorized by a masked killer who is secretly living in their attic. It should be noted that this killer never completely removes his mask, only lifts it up towards his nose to drink from and then spit in the family's orange juice. This unnamed killer, who I'll refer to as Jimmy, as the young son Max does, is obsessed with the wife, Beth, and capturing images of her. He installs secret cameras in the home and then stalks the family when they leave the home, utilizing a handheld camera. On top of this, he often engages in sustained staring and looking at them, like in this image, especially when they are sleeping, which flaunts his control over the family. It's a sustained stalking. Jimmy also frequently employs layered voyeuristic gazes with Beth, like this scene where he feels compelled to film Beth in the shower with a handheld camera, despite risking capture. Note the position of the static camera also captures the mirrors behind Jimmy, putting him in a sort of mise en abîme of perversity that is then reflected upon us as the viewer. The film oscillates between the surveillance and Jimmy's handheld camera, the latter employed when he does commit murder. Critically, he leaves the children alive at the end of the film, including son Max, who is the only family member to interact with him repeatedly, though this happens somehow with all of these cameras off screen. His murder of Beth happens after getting her to look at him at the camera and say that she loves him. The implied trauma of the children discovering their parents' dead bodies afterward is not shown. The killer moves on to choose another family for the same treatment, which links Jimmy to a lineage of slashers that operate as destructive forces of nature. Now, this cyclical, enduring violence is present in my last example, Red Woods, which was released this year. As the title implies, the backdrop is a thick forest reminiscent of Friday the 13th and Camp Crystal Lake. Centering on a conspiracy theorist, Cross, and his quest to find his brother after his brother goes missing on an urban exploration trip in rural Pennsylvania. A group of woefully curious young people trawl through the forest and a handful of abandoned houses. Before setting out on their doom search for answers, an interesting exchange occurs. I did have a clip of this exchange, but it is now replaced with a happy face because I don't want the stream to die again. So I will be summarizing it and just letting you know that the cameraman, Dutch, who is male, nicknamed for the Dutch angle so common to horror, realizes that Raven, female, is also planning to record the exploration. She is using actual VHS tapes, and he begins to mock her for this, and she responds by circling around him and saying she's going to use the Dutch angle, and he says, oh, this makes me uncomfortable, I don't like this, I don't like this. They actually have a little about 30-second battle of filming one another in this reflexive way about who gets to control the looking of the camera and also the actual tech of the camera. Is it VHS? Is it high def? So this brief discussion highlights the camera's capacity for recording, for uncovering truth, and suggests gendered concerns as to who wields it and how. The killer in this film, Devlin, pictured here behind the fire, inserts himself into the group by posing as an urban explorer who was invited on the search. Since said urban explorer uploads POV videos online, his face is unknown to the group of protagonists. They accept Devlin as an imposter, as this YouTube personality, because of the mask offered by the digital space. This mask motif is later repeated when the group gathers around the bonfire and shares frightening stories, per slasher tradition. Devlin recounts the tale of a little boy who, quote, wished he could have his own playground. He would sing, I want a playground, I want a playground. But the other kids were mean, and there was a decade of abuse going from institution to institution. All the while he'd sing, where is my playground? Where is my playground? But see, things had gotten twisted in his mind. The word play had become hurt, to inflict pain, to burn. Years later, he escaped to the remote backwoods, not far from where we are right now. This would be his playground, end quote. So as Devlin offers this chilling origin story for himself, he builds this mask-like effigy that you can see here out of wood in the bonfire. His story is not only Devlin's story, but an archetypal blueprint. Change out a few details and the plots for numerous slashers are revealed. When the protagonists find out that Devlin's murder spree is retaliatory for a childhood incident, he calls his actions a movie. One that ends with nearly everyone else, dead by gun or house fire. The actual ending reveals that Devlin has regularly operated a camera-equipped drone throughout the film for reconnaissance on his victims, but also to obtain sweeping landscape shots to complement the in-your-face recordings of the dead explorers. He truly is making a movie. He flies the drone down to eye level and then covers the camera lens, the shot nearly identical to Emily's covering of the camera in Home Movie. These psychopathic slashers clearly want to control the image as much as their victims. To conclude, a Reddit post from just a year ago laments the number of found footage slashers with very little response. It got 3 upvotes and 11 comments, and they were pretty much repetitive. So production and distribution are, of course, matters for another day and another analysis. But perhaps the issue is the inherent potency of the found footage slasher. All of these examples play with established cinematographic conventions of the slasher film, drawing these elements into the found footage world of frames and glitches. This marriage between two supposedly unholy forms can elicit a wealth of responses from viewers, of course, and authorial intent can only go so far. However, I consider found footage slashers one of the standout supreme niches of horror cinema. Unlike paranormal found footage entries where camera glitches are often aesthetic additions that hint at a ghostly presence or provide a jump scare, glitches in found footage slashers call attention to the actual hardware of the camera, the power of the camera, and the viewing mechanisms. Almost all of the glitch effects in these films are from someone rewinding VHS tape or scrubbing through digital footage. These glitches often last just as briefly as intense violence, compelling a close viewing even when the footage, and the film itself may be considered low quality. Additionally, the camera frequently changes hands in these slashers, sometimes between the killer or killers and numerous victims, in a mutual acknowledgement of the gaze's polymorphous nature. In these ways and many others, found footage slashers glitch traditional discussions of gender and violence in horror and cinema at large. We only need to hit play. Thank you very much for listening.
Thank you so much for that, Miranda. So now that we're all returning, I'm going to go ahead and begin the facilitation of the question and answer portion. So I'm going to go ahead and scroll up to the first couple questions. The first two questions focus on John's presentation. So you guys really got the chat going, so I have to scroll up a bit. Let's see. All right, the first question we have for John is from Vincent Gain, and his is a two-part question. And he asks, could the narrative progression from sex to death that we see in some slashers invite sympathy for the victims? He further states, here are happy teenagers, in some cases in love, whose young, hopeful lives are cut brutally short, kills providing pathos.
Thanks so much for that question, because the one thing I've never understood when reading academic theory is, why are we supposed to think that these victims are supposed to be punished? Why are we supposed to root against, the obvious potential heroes of the text? And why are we blaming victims so much? That's not their fault that they're getting a knife jabbed in their chest. It is the result of a psychopathic maniac. We definitely should empathize with these characters, and I believe the original intent really was to empathize with them. Along the way, yes, some self-referential things happened, which I think was a detriment to the subgenre, such as some academic work and some films. But overall, regardless of what film we're watching, we should have empathy for young teens that are either happily in love or just going about their business, or, just teens.
Excellent response. And you know what? This next question is a perfect streamline from what you just responded with. Our next question for you, John, is from Steve Jones. And he says, the way I understood the argument was not that the killers are consciously targeting individuals because they take drugs, but rather that the filmmakers are implying that drugs are bad. So in the case of stoner characters, they take drugs, it addles their awareness, so they are vulnerable and are picked off. So it is implied that one shouldn't take drugs. Also, if teens weren't so distracted trying to get laid, they might notice that the killer is around, etc. Doesn't that fit with what you're saying about security?
If you're trying to get laid, the only thing you're thinking of is your partner or your potential partner. Just that's something we understand from real life, and it translates quite well in the slasher film, as we've seen from the sex scene in Friday the 13th Part 2 that I showed, and the post-coital scene in Halloween that I showed. It's your attention is elsewhere. You're not going to notice someone slinking around in the shadows, because quite often it's only a shadow you see or a spear tip coming at you. But I honestly don't think that the filmmakers are taking a moral stance on drug use. Lots of creative types are fans of drug use. Not to, I probably shouldn't say that. But anyway, I think it's just been read by the conservative society that these films are placed on. Like, if you look at Halloween, America was moving to a point where they were just about to elect Reagan. They were falling out of love with the Curtian ideals. They were so disgusted by Nixon, the Vietnam War, the oil shortages, stuff like that. These people willingly put themselves into denial. They put themselves into suburban bliss instead of facing up to the reality of the matter. So I think it's more the way society read it rather than implication from the text themselves. It's have fun, party. And you know what? These teens look like they're having a lot more fun than some of the viewers are probably having at that moment. Like the stoners from Part 3, Friday the 13th Part 3, Chuck and Chili. They're having a great time throughout that film. They're loving life more than anybody else. And really, again, referring back to the sex stuff, It's distraction. They're just distracted.
Excellent response, John. So before we move on, do any of the other panelists like to comment on that? Agree, disagree?
I'm happy to chip in about the notion of sort of conservatism. I'm not sure any horror was ever conservative. Maybe there's a distinction between sort of the conservatism of characters within the films and the conservatism of the filmmakers of what they're trying to say. I always think of sort of David Lynch's Blue Velvet, where underneath the surface of every kind of town there's a rotting ear somewhere. There's something rotten under the surface, and I think even if you go back to sort of the silent era, that's almost a kind of fundamental part of horror.
Okay, thank you, Basil. So moving ever forward, this next question is for Marc from Cara. And her question is, when coding and counting for firearm kills, are you only counting kills in which a gun is shot or used in any way? For example, in Halloween 4, Michael impales a character with a shotgun.
Yes, I am counting that. What I do in those cases is I have notes where I, just for myself to explain how the shotgun was used if it was unusual like that. But I am counting that as a gun kill as far as the stats go.
Excellent, Marc. And we have 2 more questions for you, Marc. And I suppose you can choose which one or both that you would like to respond to. Okay. Our next one is from Vincent. And he states, you have identified gender and class bias in the weapons used. What about race? We also have another question, a bit more below from that, from Alex. And he says, oh, I apologize. I think I skipped it over. He states, great point, Marc, regarding trailers and posters. Was actually going to ask about ways slasher and horror promos, news reports, paratexts have influenced or made reductive pop press and scholarly memories of these weapons.
Yeah. Okay. Let me answer the race one first. So, what I found, you've probably heard in the thing how overwhelmingly white the genre is, and so that makes correlation between any kind of bias as far as weapons and race difficult. But one thing that I did notice that was really interesting that I haven't written about is that a lot of times Black bodies are used. I tracked whether kills occurred on screen, off screen, partially on screen as well. And what I found is that Black bodies are often used to support the fear that we're meant to have for a white woman. And so I just started to notice that as I kept track that you'll have, like in urban legend, you'll have the Black guy that's been killed, but we didn't see the kill. So we don't see the suffering, we don't identify. And the kill is only meant to make us feel fear for the imperiled white woman. As far as this other question about other aspects, to me, it's just, my plea, I guess, that there's so much to be done that in a statistical, analytic way that I think that I would love to see people think about sound in weapons or, visual presence of weapons that may be there but never used for a kill. So those would be a lot of interesting things to do going forward.
All right, excellent. So moving right along, Miranda, we have 2 questions directed at your presentation. Our first question is from Tom Watson. You talk about the snuff film thread of found footage slashers. Do any of these films use recorded footage of violence as a weapon against their victims to prolong the terror?
That's a really great question. So for some of the films, if we're talking about the ones that fall more into the slasher versus the maybe more outright snuff, absolutely. I would think that's what's also really interesting is the footage is often used in certain contexts for scaring potential victims. So, for example, in the Poughkeepsie tapes, they are showing some of these clips to a room of aspiring FBI profilers, with the idea that it will be too much for some of them, and that's how they'll weed out who can't take the job. And eventually, someone who takes the job will be trying to hunt this killer, so they could be a victim themselves. So, this, it definitely happens more so in the actual, more towards the snuff side than the found footage slasher side, but it happens.
Excellent, Miranda. And the final question is for you, Miranda. Is there a parallel between the disassembly of images by the digital camera and the physical disassembly of victims? Everything is raw material or data?
Sure. I mean, we can always talk about films having different qualities to them based on, is it 16 millimeter? Is it VHS? Is it, what's the screening context? All of these things, how it feels. And I think sometimes with these films, you can see that they're striving for the kill, or any of the violence that's perpetrated in the films, even just psychological violence, to have a certain, quality to it, have a certain coldness or a certain warmth to it. In the ones that I've looked at here as the 4 examples, when there is the tension between high def and then VHS, there's definitely an implication that the high def kills are going to be the ones where maybe they're going to splurge a little more on the VFX budget. And it does sort of reduce the people, the victims, into just pieces, into data. But that really depends on the context of the film, because each killer has his own or her own motive. It's very different in home movie, where they're recording the killing of their own parents, versus random people in the woods in redwoods.